Hey everyone, welcome to part two of the IoT ML lab. So in the last part, we went through some Vue basics. We learned about local state, we learned about the Vue data object, and we learned how to create some very basic reactivity in our Vue apps. So in part two, we're going to focus on modularizing that functionality. So like we talked about in the last module, a component-based architecture isn't typically going to produce an app which is just one component or two. We're probably going to want some nested components, and we're going to want to piece up functionality so that we can reuse it in different places, and so that our app has some natural flow and structure to it so that it's manageable past the point of creating it. So just like last time, I'm going to open up the second module here, and I'm just going to jump directly into edit project. So um, if we just go through the README very quickly and talk about what we're going to get into, I've added some additional resources here. So highly encourage everyone to check this out. Again, either before you watch the rest of this video or even during or after. I think these are going to be some really good references for how to structure Vue components, parent objects, child objects, and all that good stuff. So the things that we're really going to get into is the modular structure, the data object again, and we're going to introduce the properties object, which is going to be the way that we pass information downstream basically to the child components. Um, so another section introduced here to the README that you're going to see a lot more of is the code highlight section. So if you're just opening up this module and you haven't really done the first one, or like I said, really isn't meant to be a super uncontinuous or rather continuous thing with no breaks. This is a good place to start just to see what changed from the last module. So I'm not going to get into this code right now because I'm going to take you guys through it. But if you're just opening up this on your own, you can start here. And if you're trying to rush through it or save some time, this is a easy shortcut just to see what we had to change. So without further ado, I'm going to jump directly into app.vue again. So remember, everything in public is auto-generated. Don't worry about that. Pretty much everything downstream of readme.md is the same. Main.js is our entry point, and app.vue is really our main thing. So let's open up app.vue, and we can see that it looks a little bit different, right? So this portion we're familiar with. We already know how to do this. There is a message variable defined on the data object or the local state of the Vue component, and we are dynamically referencing that up here, and that's pretty cool. But what is this new business right here? We can see that we're importing something and we're declaring it and using it up here. So this is going to be our new component. And we're going to talk about how to create this component and how to use it in a parent component. So I'm going to put a pause on this right now, and I'm just going to jump into that parent component, or sorry, the child component. So child components are really they look exactly the same as any other components. It's just a .vue file. And the only differences from our app.vue is you can see that I haven't really defined any style. We don't really need it for the purposes of this. And actually, you can even altogether get rid of these tags. I like to keep them just to remind myself, but you absolutely don't need them. And actually, most style guides even say that you should get rid of them if you're not using them. So I don't want to teach you guys bad practices or anything like that, but yeah, they're there. There's no style, and that's all good. Um, the template also looks actually pretty similar to how app.vue looks like, right? Like we've still got the syntax, the curly brace syntax, which means we're dynamically pulling objects. And we can see a very similar pattern, right? There's a message, we've defined it here, hello from Vue component, and that's being rendered up here. But what is this guy? What is custom message? There is no custom message variable in the data object, obviously. And instead, it's defined in the props. So props are similar to this data object in that they basically contain information which the Vue component can pull dynamically. The only difference is that props are coming from upstream. They're not something that you define in this component. What you're doing when you create a prop is that you're declaring an expectation. And that expectation is that the parent component that uses this component will pass a certain kind of property. That property will be named custom message, and that property will be of type string. Okay. And here we don't know what custom message is yet because that's the responsibility of the parent component. But once we do know what custom message is, we're just going to render it here. And you can see that the syntax is exactly the same as pulling from the data object. And that's something that I actually really like about Vue. I'm be curious to hear other preferences, but basically it doesn't matter if it's defined in data or in props. Vue is smart enough to pull it from the right place. And as long as this data object is populated from the parent, then it will render here. So I'm going to step back out to the app.vue and just show you guys how this is actually defined or how it's actually passed in app.vue. So in app.vue, we can see that, first of all, we've imported the component. And this is one way to import components. I think this is the most basic, but let's just start with this one for now because I think it makes sense. You import this component kind of like how you'd import another JS file. And of course, this is ES6 syntax, so we use import, we don't use require. But actually, you can use either, I believe. Don't quote me on that in terms of Vue components, but in terms of libraries, for example, like you can require an external script or dependency. But for Vue components, I just like to do this syntax right here. So we're importing the component, but it's not all we have to do. We also have to declare it as a component. So this is just another property on the Vue class object here. So we define components, semicolon, and then in here we basically list our different components. And if I had another one, I would do, Vue component B or something like that, and we would just continue the array for as many components as we've imported here and plan to use in the HTML template. So once that's defined, it means that we can use this guy in our template tag. And right off the bat, you might notice something different is that this is cased a certain way, and this is cased a totally different way. So this is another Vue specific thing. Now, you don't have to follow this. Like you can, if you were to name this Vue component, I might not spell that correctly, but if you name it the same thing as down here, it'll still work. But you can see is that you're probably going to get a little warning. And this is, again, Vue specific. So Vue prefers that you break things out in lowercase and separate words with dashes. And you might be wondering, how does it figure it out? Well, it just does. That's one of the wonderful things of frameworks is that in the, they do a lot of quote unquote auto magical things, which in more, I guess, specific description really means that they're abstracting a lot of things for you. They're taking a lot of cognitive load from you and they're handling it with complexity that you don't see. And it's the reason for that is so that you don't have to take on that complexity as a developer. And at least in my opinion, that's a really, really good thing because reducing cognitive load as a developer for me is critical at least. So, as much of this abstraction that I can leverage is awesome. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. Back to this. You can use the syntax, it'll figure it out, or you can use the exact same casing as it is here. Your ESLint configuration just might yell at you if you have capital letters in there. But give this a shot. As you're remixing this or doing your own thing, try different casings here, try different casings here, and nothing should break. But if it does, we'd love to hear from you. Just drop a little comment, maybe in this video underneath. But it should work for the most part, and you can read up on how this is handled in the Vue documentation. Anyway, enough of that. We declare the component, and for this one, you can see that we've just got a self-closing tag here. This would be an open and close tag. This is typical of HTML. The first one is just the actual element itself, and the closing tag is the forward slash with the original tag itself, and this just tells the DOM that you're done defining whatever element that is. In this case, this is header 1. But you can also do this syntax where it's called self-closing. And the reason we're doing this obviously is because we don't need to pass a body. We just need to pass a property. So self-closing tag, and this is where we pass that data. So custom message, if you remember, is defined right here. Or sorry, it's actually defined right here. The custom message is a property that we're going to receive from the outside. So in app.vue, we're defining that. And we're saying that the custom message is hi from Vue component property. Great. Now that information basically gets passed to our child component when we render it. And this is going to populate instead of, this is just a placeholder. Obviously, it's telling us what type we expect of property. But after this gets rendered, this will be populated and then this will show up. So let's take a real quick. Let's take a look real quick. So I'm going to inspect this page and see if my Vue DevTools work. They do. Okay, so you can see these different messages here from our app, and let's investigate them a little bit. So in app, we have this data. It's just a message, right? Hello from View app. That's this guy up here. And then in the View component, we can see that that custom message property has now been populated because we passed that information, and now the prop is basically behaving just like our data. And here are the little elements themselves. You can browse them a number of different ways. So if you want to actually look at the DOM and the actual HTML that's being rendered, you can click this guy in Chrome and click either individual portions, or I'm actually just going to click the whole thing and then start breaking it out. So you can see that this div app that, if you guys remember from the first module, that was just totally empty. Now Vue has injected all of this stuff in here, everything that we created from our components, and it looks a little bit different, obviously, because it's injecting it as HTML. It's obviously not injecting it as .vue syntax or anything like that. Um, but this is, I like to show this just because it's a good way to try and debug if things aren't rendering correctly. Like, obviously your first step is this, and making sure that these pieces of information are actually being populated. Like, if you're trying to debug why this isn't rendering, first step would be, well, am I even getting the data here in the first place? Now if you are getting the data like you are right here, but you're still not seeing something, then I'd say the second place to debug is looking at the DOM itself. So maybe just click the element. This will take you right here. And again, this is working fine, so we won't have any funny business there. But if something's not happening, this might give you some hints as to what's going wrong. And that's essentially kind of it. We can create a number of different components, use them in the same exact way. This syntax and this pattern allows us to pass data downstream. Obviously, Vue has other techniques as well if you need to pass data upstream or if you need to pass globally. Those, though, are a little bit more bespoke, and for the purposes of this lab, I don't think we're really going to need to use them. We're really just going to be dealing with parent and child components. But if you're building a bigger app, maybe you need to track information about your user and their shopping cart and their history. Then your architecture gets a little bit more layered, a little bit more dense, and that's when we would want to leverage those Vue constructs, such as the Vuex, which is the Vue Global State Management System, kind of similar to React's Redux, if you guys are familiar with that one. And then there's also a functionality called emitting of events. And events are constructs in Vue that can help you pass data the opposite way. So, here we're doing parent to child, but sometimes you get into an interesting pattern where the child has to communicate back to the parent. If something changes in that child component, we might need to be aware of it upstream. So if that's the case, that's when we would leverage Vue events. But again, we're really not going to need to do that for the purposes of this lab. And if that's something you're interested in, or if you start spinning this off into your own project, highly encourage you to look at those docs. I know I keep saying that, but they're absolutely brilliant. So take advantage of those as much as possible. So other than that, I think that's really it for module 2. We've learned how to not only dynamically bind data to variables, but we've also learned how to pass that information to other Vue components. And that really allows our app to grow and scale, well, as much as we want. We could modularize functionality as to our heart's content. And if you're from the object-oriented school of thinking, then you're probably thinking, kind of like me. That's the school I come from. You're thinking, single responsibility. How do I separate discrete functions and tasks? So that might be one way of doing it. Or if you're coming from the UI UX side, you might be more thinking of atomic design, maybe more along the lines of a design system, and how you can create these individual elements which you can layer on top of one another to create a rich experience that focuses around styling, animation, aesthetics. So a lot of functionality there. Again, very, very much encourage everyone to dig into Vue and what's possible there. But that's it for part number 2. Join in for part number 3, where we're going to be taking a little bit more of a deeper dive into the Vue syntax, and we're going to try to leverage the DOM APIs for getting video capture and getting some images out. We're actually going to start getting into the meat of the sensor.